Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to welcome you today to session 11, Powering Africa, Opportunities and Financing Options in Africa's Power Sector. I'm delighted, thank you very much for the introduction, and I thought particularly good job pronouncing my name. I have to say, before we began the session, I didn't quite imagine that we'd have a clap from a room full of investors when successfully completed, so thank you very much for that. To introduce our panel, today's panel, I think, is one of significant experience in the sector, and I look forward to a full and vigorous discussion. Very briefly, to introduce the speakers before I deliver some introductory thoughts and then hand over for the individual presentations. Michael Carson with us is the Chief Executive Officer of Globalec. Charles Livy, Vice President of PW Power, an associate of Mitsubishi Heavy Industries. Ravi Suri, the Regional Head, Project and Export Finance for Middle East, Africa, South Asia and Europe for Standard Chartered Bank. Andrew Herskovitz, Coordinator for US Power Africa, and Sipho Phiri, Executive Chairman, Western Power Limited. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining us today. Before we hand over to you, just a few introductory thoughts to set the scene. We've heard a lot about the scale of opportunity in Africa's power sector, buttressed by a strong growth story, an expansion of a consuming middle class, and indeed a very strong associated need for infrastructure development to sustain that growth and as a prerequisite for future growth. And power is no doubt chief amongst these requirements for infrastructure. Briefly, just to quantify the needs at hand, we've heard talk about potentially $360 billion worth of new infrastructure projects, with perhaps 70% of that being funded by the private sector. Now, one can quibble about these numbers and how they've been arrived at, but there is no doubt that in order to support a great and growing story of further development on the continent, power will be a preeminent need. The need for further power and greater private sector involvement in that story has no doubt been emphasized to you many times throughout this conference. I think, in fact, it's been a leitmotif running throughout a number of the different sessions. And indeed, it's led to the two largest economies on the continent, South Africa and Nigeria, undertaking their own quite challenging and very brave privatization programs. Obviously, I'd look to the speakers to perhaps address some of the challenges and opportunities throughout those. But I think there is no doubt that those countries, and indeed a number of other economies, of course the nations present here at this conference, but also others, have looked to further develop their power sectors through either structured tenders or bilateral relationships. So the scale of opportunity, no doubt, is very great indeed. But there are, of course, challenges, and some of those are perceived by the governments themselves. In Nigeria, for example, it's no secret that the government has had a stop-start method to introduction of the fully liberalized power sector, hopefully concluded after a short period now this autumn. In Zambia, it's much the same story. There were risks perceived around the availability of hard currency in the country, which led to the introduction and then removal, as far as the power sector is concerned, of SI 33. And indeed, there are many other legitimate concerns on the part of government. Some of those have been aired at the sessions we've all attended. For example, we had strong interventions around the question of guarantees provided by government. What should be the limitations of those guarantees? Indeed, what do they relate to? Are they merely around credit supporting off-takers and other main project participants that may be parastatals? Is it about giving credible solutions to government risks that are assumed in power projects, and so on? And indeed, there's the very real social cost involved, the cost of power to the end user. And indeed, it's impossible to put together a development equation that doesn't take that into account. As far as investors are concerned, clearly there's the need to balance off what they might perceive as an increased risk profile in those types of circumstances against the need to preserve their returns. And therefore, it's required that they develop sophisticated risk mitigation strategies. Those will consist of different elements of risk allocation, financial structuring, technological solutions, the engagement of the ECA, DFI, and multilateral communities, and so on. So with us to help square that circle, I will now hand over to our distinguished panelists, and if I can first call Mr. Michael Carlson, Chief Executive Officer of GlobalEC, to the stand.
Thank you, Dimitri. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, good afternoon. I do admire your stamina. This is the last session of the summit. I want to thank you for your attendance here. So we're going to cover 5 things during my presentation. I'm going to talk about GlobalEC, who we are and what we do. Talk about the African power market, why I think there's never been a better time to invest in Africa in power than today. We're going to look at the success stories in South Africa around the renewable energy program, an additional success story in Côte d'Ivoire, and we're going to finish off with a couple of factors that will greatly attract more private capital to our markets. I'm going to have to look at this system here. It's very sophisticated, but doesn't seem to be working. I'm supposed to have my, there it comes. My slides here. Talking about GlobalEC then. We were created in 2000 by CDC, and since we started, we've been in 27 different countries for a total of 14,000 megawatts. Our leading activity is in Africa, where we're the leading private power company, producing electricity to 15 million people. So if we go through the assets that we have in Africa today, we start with the Savo project in Kenya on the east side. We were one of the first developers of IPPs in Kenya, and we're the largest shareholder in that project. Songas, Tanzania, the largest producer of electricity in Tanzania, generating about 1/3 of the electricity in the country. A low-cost producer, producing about 50% of the gas into the system. And TPDC, government-owned gas entity in country, made an assessment as to the savings of our gas-fired project versus importing expensive fuel oil. And since we started in 2004, we saved the country $4.5 billion of fuel savings, which is very significant. In South Africa, we have 3 assets coming out of the renewable energy program, 140 megawatt wind projects and 250 megawatt solar projects. We acquired 2 assets in Cameroon from AES earlier this year, Kribi and Dibamba, about 300 megawatts together. And in Côte d'Ivoire, we're converting a gas turbine facility to a combined cycle power plant. So moving on to the African power market, why do I think that today is the best time to invest in that market ever? Well, first of all, it's the fastest growing market in the world. More than 5% per annum demand growth, which is very substantial. What's driving that growth is, of course, the economic underlying growth of the countries in Africa. But also, just as important, remember there's only about 1 in 5 that have access to power in sub-Saharan Africa. So as we connect more customers, we also get more growth. We're seeing enormous amount of growth in the gas area as we find more domestic gas, whether that's in Tanzania, Uganda, Mozambique, or Ghana, or other markets. I find that fuel source very compelling, it's very cost effective, it's very reliable, and it's very clean. We also have renewable power being more and more implemented on the African continent, and the economics of renewables are improving as the cost of installing wind and solar are being reduced over time. Finally, we are seeing some of the biggest markets, South Africa and Nigeria, opening up to the private sector, which greatly increases the amount of investment opportunities that we have in the private sector. So if we turn to one of those, starting with South Africa, it's been a remarkably successful program that was initiated in 2011. So the government came out with clear goals saying we're going to double our capacity by 2030, so going from 40 gigawatts to 80 gigawatts in that system. And 42% of that will be renewable energy, which is about 18,000 megawatts. So far, phase 1 has all been awarded out, 3,900 megawatts, 64 projects, mobilized private capital of 120 billion rand in 2.5 years time period, which is a remarkable achievement. Second phase has started. There's a procurement process in August 18th, under the second phase, which we participated in. Very transparent procurement rules. Procurement process run by the Treasury. Standard contracts, everybody gets the same contractual arrangement, same PPA, same grid connections, same government guarantee under the implementation agreement, and very strong government support for the process and for the contracts. So the government, with Eskom buying all the power, sorting out all the grid connections, government guarantee running the procurement process, and then the private sector having the developers, securing land, permits, wind resource, solar resource, private capital investing, lender capital going into them, and equipment suppliers and construction contractors building them. It's been a remarkably successful program. If you move to another story, very different environment. In Côte d'Ivoire, where we have the Acito project, which we are increasing the capacity by 50%, using no additional fuel. We generate no additional emissions. We actually get emission credits for this application. This is a project we were involved in since 1998. There was a coup, civil unrest, and so the expansion project we initially intended to do, only in 2000s, never happened. And we then bought out majority shareholders right before the election. We had an election crisis. Somebody forgot to tell the two candidates that only one of them could be elected. And following that civil unrest, when Ouattara finally came to power, we then signed the contracts and went to financial closing. Key to success, that we can do this deal so shortly after all that unrest and difficulties, is that Côte d'Ivoire has had a very successful history of private power. It's one of the pioneers of private power. When Ouattara was prime minister in the early 1990s, he privatized the whole electricity sector. Again, very strong government support, very strong development finance, institutional support from World Bank, IFC, African Development Bank, FMO, Proparco, DAG, and so on. And then, of course, our skills in putting this transaction together. My clock has run down to 0, so I'm going to pick up speed. That means I have about 2 minutes left. So I'm going to try to wrap up in 2 minutes. So if we look at kind of more broadly speaking success factors that I found to be successful in Africa, I can say that the markets which has opened up to the private sector have been mostly successful in having reliable, cost-effective power. Examples of that is Kenya. We went through the South African Renewable Energy Program. Côte d'Ivoire has reliable power. There's very few blackout times, as in many other countries. So private sector is doing a really good job in bringing in the capacity on time, on schedule, and then operating our power plants. I mean, we have availabilities in our power plants of 97 to 98%. Government-run power plants might be in the 50s. So you need 2 government plants essentially to generate the same amount of electricity as one of ours could. You need clear rules about procurement and contracts, like I outlined in South Africa. And in most cases, the utility off-taker, the one that signs the 20-year power purchase agreement, is not credit-worthy. So we need government guarantees to support the payment obligation of the off-taker. And finally, you need the right tariffs. Hugely important that when you compete with new power, that you actually compete with new additional power. You don't compete with existing power base that's already been paid for and obviously would therefore be a lower cost producer of electricity. And finally, hugely important that the end user tariff is set at a level where the utility business in country is cash flow positive and they can honor their undertakings and obligations. Finally, just want to share with you some of the awards we've gotten. So we got 2 consecutive years of being selected as the International Energy Business of the Year in the emerging markets. And we got 2 awards, Deal of the Year awards for the Acito project in Côte d'Ivoire. Thank you so much for listening. Again, I'm admiring the staff and I'm looking forward to a Q&A session.
Thank you very much for that, Michael. And if I can perhaps hand over to Charles Levy now.
Good afternoon. Thank you for your tenacity and staying power, again, to be present for the last session today. I'm going to speak from a technology perspective as far as risk mitigation in terms of power projects. As this is a financial summit, if you will, I am going to discuss 3 elements of risk, focusing on the technology sector, as risk is always a predominant factor in addressing financeability of projects, which is key for a project to go forward. From my perspective, there are really three areas of significant risk that a project must address. The first one is power offtake agreements such that you can service the debt and service the debt profitably. The second element is fuel supply agreements such that the fuel supply agreements cooperate and support the offtake agreements in the event that there is disruption or price disparities. The financial offtake agreements are tied to the fuel supply agreements, again, to service the debt and have a financially successful project. And the area where I'm going to concentrate on is really technology selection and technology considerations with respect to all phases of a project, such that you can support the project is maintainable, the project is, can be implemented and executed on a fast track and low risk profile, thus ensuring high reliability and availability, and again, the success and enableization of a project to be operable such that it services debt and is profitable. Again, a common denominator there is the ability for decisions to be made such that debt can be serviced in the project development phase. That being said, I think one has to take a very pragmatic look at a project and address really all of the phases of the project. First of all, what are the infrastructure requirements of technology being selected? Constructability of a project, the difficulties and complexities or the simplicity of technology selection as it relates to construction and constructability. Are there adequate resources in country, both from a supply provision and also a technical expertise provision to facilitate low-risk construction of certain technologies that are selected? The equipment installation, what are the requirements relative to equipment installation, and again, the complexities around certain technologies that are selected? Commissioning and operations and maintainability for the lifecycle support considerations of the power. A number of items that are identified here. I'm not going to go through all of them for sake of timing, but again, you'll have to look at your civil works, your mechanical works, your electrical works relative to the complexities and the ability to install certain technologies in a fashion that introduces a very low-risk profile. And there are many technologies that are available in today's day and age that are designed around installation in challenging areas. And I think the areas, certainly some countries that we're talking about here and many countries that are represented in the sub-Saharan Africa regions certainly reflect those challenges and considerations that are of utmost importance with respect to risk mitigation as it relates to technology offerings. Again, the level of construction requirements from a supply perspective and also an expertise perspective. Many elements to consider, not only with respect to constructability, but also life cycle support. Residence expertise subsequent to the installation, demanding that from equipment suppliers. Contract structure in the development of installation contracts. Clear lines of responsibility that are defined such that you're not in the middle of the project and you have contract disputes. Reliability guarantees and availability guarantees to ensure that the equipment does perform in accordance with its professed capabilities from the equipment suppliers. That's critical in contract development and contract support. And with respect to operating requirements, there's a number of things to consider for technology requirements, especially in areas that are challenging with respect to infrastructure support and sustainability. Fuel requirements, sensitivity and characteristics of the fuel for certain technologies. Synchronous condensing operations, whereby if a reactive power or load following requirements are mandated by the distribution grid, the equipment has the capability to operate in such fashions. Part load performance relative to load following capabilities in environments where there is not a constant load and cyclic operation is of utmost importance, and certainly quick start capabilities for backstopping grid requirements. Again, these are all technical considerations that should be required, should be considered, and honestly, some of these technologies that offer these capabilities can be used to negotiate advantageous positions with respect to your offtake agreements as far as having additional capabilities that could service the grid. Distributed power is another approach to consider. It's a little bit more of a top-level approach than the technology consideration. But distributed power, I mean smaller generation assets strategically located in areas of load concentrations versus larger installed capacity, centralized generation stations and relying on a distributed grid. Some of the benefits of distributed power are more accessibility and more reactive capability to the grid that it's servicing, less capital required due to smaller plants, and the ability to add distributed generation assets as the economic conditions mandate and are required. And the other consideration, especially from a financial perspective, is there are technologies out there that can be easily moved and relocated in order to service areas outside the original area of interest, and to be perfectly frank, in less desirable conditions, the ability to repatriate assets in the event of default on contractual conditions. And that can be a significant benefit and a significant risk mitigation in consideration of financial risk. Finally, the last thing to consider is the maintenance. What are the maintenance profiles and maintenance requirements of the technologies you selected? Does the country have the proper infrastructure, and if not, can proper strategic spares and expertise be located in country such that you maintain a high reliability and availability of the equipment? Some examples of that are aeroderivative gas turbines, for example. They have the ability to be switched out where the maintenance, either scheduled or unscheduled, are done off-site, but an asset can be installed in less than a 24-hour period, and a plant can be taken down and restarted again with less than a day of operation shutdowns. Again, life cycle support is something that sometimes is not necessarily considered or well planned in the development phase, but absolutely critical for the availability and reliability and longevity, if you will, of a plant. And again, getting back to my initial comments and fundamental risk considerations is to be able to service a debt and service a debt from a profitable perspective. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chuck. If I could hand over now to Ravi Suri from Standard Chartered Bank for his introductory remarks.
Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I've got 7 minutes or 5 minutes to talk to you and give an opening statement. I'd actually like to share with you some of the positives of Africa. I mean, as you go around and as you talk to people and you talk to the lending community, everyone keeps telling us, how difficult things are in Africa. It's not possible to get these large projects funded, and Africa is complicated and it takes time. I'm not for a moment diluting the challenge, but let's focus on what Africa is doing right. And really, there are 4 things which Africa is doing right. The first thing which it's doing right is it's unbundling its power sector correctly. This is very important because many countries got their power sector wrong, their privatization wrong, because they unbundled incorrectly. And Africa is doing it right. If you take the example of Nigeria, and if you see how Nigeria has unbundled its power sector, it's absolutely the right way to do it. And what do you mean by unbundling? By unbundling, you mean you need to break up, the generation, the transmission, and the distribution. And you need to do it correctly. And you need to regulate different elements of the chain differently. That's why you need to unbundle it. And you need to regulate that element of the chain which is monopolistic, which is transmission. But where there is competition, like generation, you don't need to regulate. Many countries got it wrong. Their power sector was derailed. Africa is doing it right. Nigeria is leading the way. So I think that's one big tick the box which Africa is doing right. The second thing which Africa is doing right is that it is got the right fuel on the margin. Many countries got it wrong. Even developed countries got it wrong because they got the wrong fuel on the margin, and then they had to introduce things like vesting contracts and regulatory support to be able to get that fuel competitive. Africa is doing it correctly. In countries where there's gas, they're using gas-based projects. In countries where renewables are strong, where there's wind and wind comes at the right time with peaking requirements, they're using wind. Now, there are transportation bottlenecks for infrastructure. There are transportation bottlenecks for transmission, which are huge challenges, but they're getting the right fuel on the margin. Africa also has an issue with respect to transmission because they've not got the grid integrated and they've not been able to get the distribution companies to be able to unbundle correctly, because the time has been short for these investments to be made. So projects need to be integrated into the financing. So if you're doing a power project on a gas-based plant, you've got to look at gas-based infrastructure, which comes as part of the plan. And Africa is doing that correctly, and the projects are looking at that in terms of their transmission and their distribution requirements. So that's another very important tick the box, which Africa is doing correctly. The third thing which Africa is doing correctly is that it is embracing credit enhancements very well. Now, you know, the governments cannot get private capital in the form that they are right now. Many of the utilities are not profitable. Many of the governments in Africa are reaching certain indebtedness caps with respect to their funding. So they are embracing the right credit-enhanced instruments. And these credit-enhanced instruments are vital for the financing. The World Bank Partial Risk Guarantee Cover is a very powerful tool which can be used quite effectively by governments. And again, many other countries, when they privatized and they went along the path, did not use these instruments. You know, Africa is using it right. The World Bank, the MEGA cover, the African Development Bank, the developmental institution agencies, they are playing a very critical and they're playing a very important role. And they are helping in this whole financing program to take these development forward. And the governments are working with these developmental agencies to make this happen. Now, this is not easy because, you know, certain reforms have to be put in place, certain developmental issues need to be done. So it has to be a partnership between these agencies and the governments. And the governments and these agencies need to work closely together. And Africa is doing this very well and doing it right. So if you see the combination of the three elements of the right fuel in the margin, the correct unbundling, and these credit enhancements, it makes a case for extremely bankable projects. And the net result of this is that you ultimately get a low tariff, which then results in the merit order dispatch position being high in the system grid, which is an extremely important risk mitigation. So because of these three issues, you're ultimately deriving the fact that you're going to get competitive power, which is critical, as some of the other speakers on this panel have also highlighted, that it's critical for financing. So with these three things in mind, what is it that, you know, developers and banks, when they go into these projects, what do they need to look at? And you have to have a different look at this as compared to other parts of the world. You know, when most developers go into projects, they look at the financing from an inside-out kind of view. You know, that's not the way to do these projects in Africa. You've got to look from outside in. You know, you're not supposed to structure the projects and then take it to the banking community. You're supposed to structure the banking community. You're supposed to structure the projects so that the banking community and the banking credit mix which you've decided will accept it. So if you're doing a project in Nigeria, if you're doing a project in Kenya, if you're doing a project in Gabon, you've got to first decide, you know, what is your lending mix going to be? Who's going to be the community lending? Is it going to be a mix of commercial banks? Is it going to be a mix of DFIs? Is it going to be a mix of financial institutions? Is it going to be a mix of local banks? Understand what credit appetite they want and what credit risk they can accept. And then dovetail and layer your credit enhancements over that. If you do it the reverse, and, you know, design a package, design the structure like you can do in other markets, like you can do in Asia, you can do in the Middle East, and then go to the banks, you're going to have, you know, a significant time lag, and probably even have some of your projects getting derailed, which is what has happened. So if you look at what Africa has done correctly, and if you look at the projects from outside in rather than from inside out, I'm reasonably confident that these projects can get financed, and they can get financed on time. And you heard some examples of some other projects which are done on time. There are many other examples, you know, which we worked on, which have been done on time. We financed a fertilizer project in Nigeria, you know, looking at these principles. And from the date we started financing to the date we closed it, it was 12 months, which is by any standards, world standards, you know, a good time scale to do a limited recourse project financing. Thank you.
Absolutely on time. Thank you. Thank you very much, Ravi. If I can hand over to Andrew Herskovich from US Power Africa.
I was going to stay seated, but I decided to stand instead. When I was in law school at Georgetown, I used to walk into the back of the class, put my head down, and fall asleep during lectures, and my girlfriend at the time would constantly tell me how rude I was. And I said, I'm paying a lot of money for tuition to listen to this professor speak, and it's his responsibility to entertain me. And if he can't do that, then that's his problem. So I say the same to you. If I can't keep you awake, that's my problem, not yours this late in the... Yeah. And I'm just doing this for, So Power Africa is President Obama's initiative to try to double access to electricity in sub-Saharan Africa. And when he announced it a little bit over a year ago in Cape Town and then Tanzania, a lot of people were left wondering, really, what's this all about? He announced a $7 billion commitment from the U.S. government, and at the time set the goal of adding 10,000 megawatts and 20 million connections in 6 focus countries, which were Tanzania, Ethiopia, Kenya, Liberia, Nigeria, and Ghana. And in the first year, we actually were quite successful, but it was a learning process. As you can tell, the countries that I listed as these focus countries really have very little in common with one another. And it was purposely set up that way because we wanted to see what kind of impact we could have in these countries by taking the tools from 12 different U.S. government agencies, putting them together and coordinating them all, and responding to the private sector itself. So what makes Power Africa different from all the other energy and donor programs that have existed in the past is this is completely private sector driven. We had to spend a lot of the first year explaining to our host government partners that we weren't cutting a check for $1 billion in each of the countries. What we're trying to do is put that stamp of approval from the U.S. government on each of those countries saying these are good places to invest. We don't want to invest donor funds in these countries because power projects should be bankable and they should be sustainable. And when you have donor funds pouring in there, you distort the market and you create an environment where these projects aren't sustainable in the long run. Perfect example would be in Liberia, where Liberia has about $1.5 billion of donor funding. Now, it's been disrupted quite a bit because of the Ebola crisis, but just for the energy sector alone, it had that kind of funding available. Well, when you've got $1.5 billion of donor funding available, you can't expect a company to go into the off-grid space and expect to compete. Whereas you look at a country like Kenya, where there's donor funding, but it's a very small portion of the overall GDP, and you see all kinds of businesses flourishing at the community level and at the large-scale level, at the grid level. It's because there's this incentive for the private sector to make a difference, and there's a competitive sector. So the commitment that we made is that I don't want to distort the sector. We want the private sector to do the work. What we saw in the first year was that the U.S. government, Power Africa, played some role in helping up to close to 3,000 megawatts of the 10,000 megawatts reach financial close. Now, I'd be lying to you if I told you that everything, and anybody who knows anything about the energy sector, you don't start one year and then a year later you suddenly reach financial close. A lot of these projects that we've been working on were projects that have been in the works for close to a decade. Lake Turkana in Kenya, they'd been working on that for 9 years or so before it reached financial close. But what Power Africa did is we did come in, and sometimes our role is small. Sometimes it's as small as having the ambassador call up the Attorney General and ask him to get a document off his desk and move it forward. And sometimes it's a lot more significant. It has to do with us hooking the developer up with financing and figuring out how to make sure this deal moves forward. So what we do is we take the traditional development sector, the development sector of what, people would come in and they'd opine on the sector and say, this is what needs to be done, and you hope that it happens within the next decade. Instead, you throw that large carrot on the table for the government and say, if you want 1,000 megawatts, this is what you need to do. If you want 50 megawatts, this is what you need to do. And we hope that obstacle, whatever it is, whether it's a policy obstacle or a technical obstacle, once we blow through that obstacle, it's going to clear the path for other projects. We're not going to wait around. We're going to just look at it deal by deal. And this model has been working. I'll give you a few examples. In Nigeria, the PPA process related to the gas privatization, it was getting stalled over the desire for host government guarantees. And one of our transaction advisors who's on the ground, because that's our model, we have people on the ground in the countries, he designed this put-call option agreement. Now, I'm a lawyer. I didn't even really know what this was all about until recently. But basically, it was something that was in between a sovereign guarantee and something that gave the developer the comfort that they needed to move forward. That particular clause has now been used in more than a dozen different agreements, and now they're looking at it in Ethiopia and other countries. Similarly, in Ethiopia was completely closed to private sector investment. I heard someone this morning talk about, oh yeah, Ethiopia, other than the telecom sector, it's completely open. That's not true. It's not. And the energy sector, they're working towards it. There are a lot of issues there, but the government is committed to opening the sector. There are wonderful opportunities for investment in Ethiopia. We're excited about Corbeti geothermal. East Africa's got up to 20,000 megawatts, it's been estimated, of clean geothermal power available, and it's some of the highest quality geothermal resources in the world. But investors are going to Asia, Latin America, places where they know the operating environment. And if you're, as I always describe it to people, if you're working for a big company and you're a junior level, person working for the company, are you going to go and pitch Tanzania geothermal to your board or to your boss? Or are you going to go and pitch a deal in the Philippines where it's a much better known sector? You're going to pitch the safer bet. So we have to get to the point where people view these African investments as much safer bets because the investments are there. We know it. We know that all the people in this room are interested in investing in Africa. There's more money available than there are projects. So for those of you who think, and this is, we had a session a few weeks ago where we brought together institutional investors and pension funds from all over the world, but mostly from OECD countries together, just prior to the African Leaders Summit. And I estimated there was probably $3 or $4 trillion of assets in the room. And what I was hearing from them was that, well, we don't really want to get too involved in the projects, but if you want to kind of package them up for us and bring them to us, we're tired of getting the 0.5 to 1% rate of return, and we'd like to get these larger rates of return. Well, guess what? There's plenty of money in Africa and elsewhere, and they're not going to wait around to package everything up for you nicely. You've got to take some risk, and you've got to get involved. You've got to put people on the ground. Unfortunately, it's not as easy as other places, but it's there. I mean, we got to get to the point where people aren't learning about projects just from sitting around the pool at the major hotel in the country. And we got to get to the point where information is being shared in a much more systematic way. And that's one of the things that Power Africa is seeking to do as we move forward so that we're more of a clearinghouse for information. Now, as a result of the progress that we made in the first year, President Obama, he loves loves Power Africa. And I wasn't really completely convinced of this until I watched at the African Leaders Summit where he sat there and he did an interview and he just off the cuff kept talking about the importance of why Power Africa is going to make a difference to improving the lives of youth. It's something he's strongly committed to doing. This is about creating greater partnerships between the United States and Africa, but it's not just about U.S. companies. I would say that only about a third of our partners are U.S. companies. We've got 12 U.S. government agencies. We've got the World Bank with a $5 billion commitment, the African Development Bank, a $3 billion commitment. The government of Sweden gave a $1 billion commitment, and that's finishing up? Okay. Anyway, feel free to ask questions. I only saw one person sleeping.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. If I can ask Sipho Ferry to come and speak to us. Thank you very much, Sipho.
All right, well, that's going to be difficult to follow. Protocols, as we like to do in Zambia. First, like to acknowledge Mr. Enoch Kabendele. He's now an infrastructure developer building Zambia's first private railway, Northwestern Railway. And also, by the way, was the former Vice President of the Republic of Zambia. His daughter, Senda, who we call a refugee working with KPMG here. We're trying to get her to come back home. My business partners, potential partners, ladies and gentlemen. And my clock's not going so fast when I'm up here. We had a discussion before this. Was this the graveyard shift? Or is it the grand finale? And I've been looking at everyone's faces trying to work out whether we are grand finale. I think power, as everyone has said, the presidents as well, and the presidential panel, is crucial to the way forward for Africa. Western Power Company in Zambia, Zambia's first greenfield IPP in hydro. We have about 60 megawatts on the Zambezi, upper Zambezi River. And it's been an interesting curve. I think we've heard about government's interest in Africa on doing this. We've had a lot of support from the government, various governments. The issue comes down to, I think, the last point about risk. And a lot of investors here are looking at what the risk profile is. Africa's changed a lot. It's no longer, we aren't waiting. We're all trying to move forward, and we are looking for partners. IFC had a senior delegation at our office last week, and I said exactly that to them. We're looking for partners. We're not looking for bosses. We want someone to come alongside us. We have the opportunity, and you have the capital. And together, we can make it work. And it's not about putting one in front of the other. And I think we are getting traction with that message, and we're not the only ones. And people are beginning to understand that as Africans, we can work alongside you, we can develop these projects, and we're going to develop these projects. The risk issues, we have so many subjects on our panel, but I'll keep it short. When it comes to this issue about the returns, everyone's looking for returns, and Africa has fantastic returns. The question is, at what point do you want to come in to get those returns? The earlier you come in, the bigger your returns are going to be, because it's a risk-return model. The risks are higher. A lot of what we hear is we need to de-risk the project. And that's fine. We will de-risk the project. We're all on that process of de-risking. But ultimately, the greater we de-risk it, the less your return is going to be. There are industry norms for all of this. It's not rocket science. Once you've passed technical and economic feasibility, you can work out what your return will be. It's very simple. De-risking, whether it's through technologies, whether it's through MEGA and other types of insurance, political risk covers, those are all processes which will effectively reduce your return. And the issue is, who is willing to come in early and get the bigger returns? And to do that, and to de-risk your earliest returns, is, we feel, working with local partners and working with local communities. So I think we'll turn over to the panel now and let Dimitri get on with it.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much all for your contributions. I will shortly throw open the session for questions from the floor, but if I can take moderator's privilege. There's been a lot of discussion about tariffs and setting the right level of tariffs in a way that can be borne by the end user in a sensible way in an African context. And indeed, this occupied quite a bit of time at the presidential panel yesterday as well. If I can ask you, and maybe I'll address this to Michael Carlson, what is the right way to square that circle?
That's a very interesting question. So I like to say that the most expensive power is the power you don't have. Because the power you don't have has a very significant impact on economic development, job opportunities, and so on. So I think from a policy perspective, what you want to ensure is that you pick the right technology. And so that depends a lot on the fuel source you have available to you. I used the example of Tanzania in my example, where we use domestic fuel and generating power for 5.5 cents a kilowatt hour. Now, the end user tariff in Tanzania is 17. So, somebody's taking a 5.5 cents power, selling it for 17, and making a nice profit on that portion. Of course, the other portion, which is imported fuel oil running in rental type of machines, the Minister of Energy told me the most expensive power was 63 cents a kilowatt hour. So it's quite a substantial premium to what we have. So the way I think you have to go about doing this, and I think Kenya actually is probably the best model for this, is to have cost-reflective tariffs. So the end user tariff in Kenya are adjusted if external cost goes up, such as fuel prices and so on. And then to the private sector, normally there's kind of a capacity payment that is paid that tend to be preset at the time you sign the contract. That's normally fixed charged. And then you have the variable charges then coming through. And that's then what the government pays for private power. In addition to that, the government has to add cost of distribution, cost of transmission, losses, theft, and so on. And in the end, have an end-user tariff that actually generates enough cash for these utilities to be cash flow positive. So they're not a drain on the government's budget. And so normally that's the regulator's responsibility to make sure they set the right tariffs so that there's sustainability on the delivery of power in country, but also the right level of tariff to attract new power. If the tariffs are too low, there's no room for new investments, and over time you run out of power. I guess South Africa is an excellent example of that, where for many years the power tariffs were very low, there were no new installments, and in the end there were brownouts and blackouts.
Thank you very much for that, Michael. In terms of attracting new investment in the area of transmission and distribution in particular, because it strikes me that that is also a part of the equation that's missing. And maybe I'll ask this question to Andrew Herskowitz. Is Power Africa stepping in to help governments develop those transmission assets and attract investment in that area?
So keep in mind, we've got 12 U.S. government agencies, including the Millennium Challenge Corporation, involved in Power Africa. And they're the ones who focus mostly on infrastructure and distribution and transmission. But really, our end goal is to not be focusing exclusively on that, because that's expensive, and we're trying to drive the private sector investment towards the distribution and transmission. So the MCC has done some of those projects, but it's more looking at when it's appropriate for the private sector to get involved there. But that's more of an area where the governments themselves also need to make a commitment. If you look at, for example, at the Inga 3 project in the Congo, the government of South Africa has agreed to be responsible for, if that moves forward with developing the transmission lines going through South Africa. And in fact, we had a conversation just today about this, about whether or not it's going to be high voltage DC or if it's going to be AC, because it has significant implications, political and otherwise, but that has huge cost implications, and the conversation was going to be, well, who's going to bear that cost? And most likely it would have to, this is what the government would have to figure out, because I can't see the private sector necessarily financing that completely unless there's a huge incentive for them to do that.
And Michael, you wanted to jump in there?
Yeah, I think distribution companies are run successfully in Africa by private companies. Take our parent company, TGAIS, as an example. They're running the distribution company in Uganda called Umeme, that was recently listed on the stock exchange. It's run very efficiently. The savings gone down substantially. A lot of new investments been made. Also, Actis just took over the utility business in Cameroon. So Sunel is now owned by Actis, and that's not just the distribution, that's the distribution, transmission, and the hydro portfolio that they are running in a private basis to kind of get more efficient, less losses, and new investments in the sector. So I think it's an area where the private sector can do more, and if you have the right framework, I think the private sector will do more.
So there is continued investment in these assets in order to facilitate evacuation of power. We've touched a little bit on the question of tariffs. Let's speak a little bit about financing, and particularly how do developers engage with their financiers and the ECA DFI community in order to structure the financing of their projects. Ravi, maybe over to you. Maybe you can give us some insight in that area.
Okay, as I said, you got to look at the three elements in my talk of how to get financing. But it all comes down to acceptable tariffs. And your first question is absolutely pertinent from a financer's perspective. And acceptable tariffs actually come down to the right risk mitigation. Many times these projects are getting wrong because developers are asking for higher returns because the wrong risk is being passed on to the wrong party. So you've got to get your risk correct, your risk mitigation correct. So don't ask governments to take risks which they are not designed to take. And don't take risks which you're not designed to take. So if you get that right, then you get the tariff right, if you get the fuel on the margin right, and if you get the unbundling correct. So you get all these elements in, then banks and financial institutions can come and look at it. Now, you don't need government support. If you go and say, I want a governmental support, if I want a governmental guarantee, you're going to set your project up for failure because many of the governments can't give you the governmental guarantees because they are already reaching indebtedness caps. So you've got to look at performance guarantees. So you've got to have a power purchase agreement, and you've got to have the performance of the power purchase agreement guaranteed, not a finance guarantee. And then you look for gaps within that power purchase guarantee where it can't fill in or it can't be fulfilled. And then you look to instruments like the partial risk guarantee cover from MIGA, from the World Bank, from the USAID. I mean, USAID is playing a phenomenal role in this. I mean, just you talked about distribution. This is where USAID can play a role by helping governments and private banks fund these projects and giving them support, giving them capital, giving them credit enhancements. So if you look at these elements, then banks and ECAs and multilateral and financial institutions can come forward. And we've seen examples of that. The privatization of Nigeria, the first private IPP, we are working on that very closely, is a classic example of how if these elements are mitigated, banks and funding agencies can come in and look at it.
But just picking up on your point on the question of government guarantees, I think that's been discussed quite a lot. And I think it's probably fair to say that most models for IPPs are starting to move away from blanket financing guarantees from governments. I don't really think they're realistically on the table, and certainly we heard from Ghana that this was very much the case. But how do we deal with the question of the government standing behind government risks in the question of risk allocation?
Yeah, and that's a very good question. And you don't need the government to guarantee debt to stand by government risk. You don't need that. The way the government's supposed to stand by it is through performance guarantees. So if you have a power purchase agreement, and if for some reason the power is not dispatched due to the fault of the power company, then obviously the government doesn't stand behind that. But if you have got a payment obligation to be made and it's not made because the power has been dispatched, then the government stands behind that. Now, you've got to make sure that all this will only work if your fundamental economics of the power are right. So if you've got a government power, a performance guarantee for a power purchase agreement where the tariff is not right or the wrong fuel is in the margin, you're heading yourself up for failure. So once you put all this in place, you have performance guarantees, you take away the sovereign indebtedness guarantee cap of that country by making it a performance guarantee. That's what you got to work on. However, some of these projects will still need governmental support. So you don't do that through a government guarantee, but you do it through public sector investments. So the question on transmission is a classic example where you can try and get private capital, but private capital is going to find it difficult because it's monopolistic in nature. Private capital works when it's not monopolistic, which is generation. So there you will have the entities of the government actually funding you, but you can have MIGA or other institutions giving you a non-ordering of sovereign cover, guaranteeing you. Now, then there can be a back-to-back arrangement with governmental agencies through MIGA. So you actually avoid a direct government guarantee, but you still get the credit enhancement and you get the government agencies to fund it. So both will coexist, and that is the way you tackle the problem of government caps and still get private capital to fund these projects.
But are ECAs, multilaterals, MIGA in particular, the World Bank, nimble enough to provide the kind of cover in the type of time frame needed in order to support projects that are happening? And maybe, Andrew, your perspective on this as well.
I'm sorry.
I mean, how can the multilateral community engage more proactively with governments in order to ensure that they can provide the type of support we've been discussing, but in a time frame that allows a project to happen sensibly?
In terms of government guarantees you're talking about?
No, in terms of MIGA, for example, facilitating the issuance of backstopping or credit supporting, credit enhancing.
So again, I mean, I would tend to agree that I think we need to get away more and more from having the donor community playing a role. I mean, we're doing it, but we need to get to the point where the donor community doesn't need to be involved in the deal to provide these types of risk reduction or risk enhancements. So the what we're doing. I mean, we're doing this with several projects, and you look at it. In some cases, we have OPIC working with the African Development Bank, where one will provide sort of the bridge financing, and then the other one is making stepping in later on to make sure that the deal's moving forward. But for the most part, I mean, we're looking at other tools that might be available, but where we need to be is we need to get to the point where these are not necessary and that the market itself is, people are gauging the risks themselves and pricing the risks themselves. We are looking at the development of other sort of risk mitigation tools. In fact, part of our team just this week drafted something for me about a risk mitigation product that we might develop. My response was, well, if some insurance companies and other private sector entities are already developing these tools, is there really a role for us there? Because again, I don't want us to distort the market. So this is where we have to be really, really careful and also get donors aligned. And I think that's one of the areas where Power Africa has been very successful, is that you have multiple donors who all want to develop their own products, and then the developers, the host governments, they all play us off one another. And then we have these, well-intentioned development assistance packages that really don't go anywhere, or they're actually screwing up the market a little bit. And we've seen this happen just recently with the geothermal risk mitigation facility that's very well-intentioned in East Africa, where they're giving grants of $6 to $8 million for exploratory drilling, and they've got to keep their money moving. Of the grants that they've awarded, there hasn't been, none of the drilling's taken place quite yet, and they're trying to put pressure on the people to do the drilling, and they're saying, do you really want us to drill before we know that this is going to be, a resource that's going to, bear fruit? So we just have to be very careful about how much we get involved, and we need to let the private sector sort of manage the market itself.
See, if I can just add to that, if you were to see the curve of the capital flow into Africa, it would be like this. I don't have a graph, but I'll just try and show it pictorially. On the bottom edge of this graph is government grants and government funding, where Africa was 6-7 years ago. Towards the lower end is when you get these credit enhancements and you get the unbundling done. Now, what the credit enhancements do, like what the World Bank and what MIGA do, is they help the structure get unbundled, and they give this cover, and they get private capital to come along with it. But the deals are heavily laden in front of the DFIs and the ECAs. And to the point Andrew made, as you go along this curve and you move further along, you'll find less and less of this cover coming in, and you'll find more and more of commercial banks coming in and taking clean risk. But this part is very critical to get them to catalyze to come in and also help the governments unbundle. That's where these agencies are playing a big role. And on the tip of it, as you go further along, will be your pure capital markets and your pure bonds, which Africa will work towards too. But these agencies have catalyzed that process.
And Sifo and Michael, just from a developer's perspective, is that your experience as well? Is the interaction smooth in that regard?
Well, I think we're one of the biggest users of MIGA insurance coverage. We use it in Nicaragua, Honduras, in Cote d'Ivoire and Cameroon, as an example. And we never find them to be the slowest guy to get the deal done. We think they're doing actually quite an excellent job with their products, very compelling product. The key is, when it comes down to the government interaction and the DFIs, if the government is willing to do what it takes to get a deal done, there's not been a transaction that we looked at in Africa or elsewhere where the capital is not mobilized, whether that's DFI capital or whether that's private capital. And so the question is, what does the government have to do? And Robbie was talking about this performance guarantee. So if there is a utility off-taker in the country that signs the power purchase agreement, the government has to assure that that payment is made. How do they do that? Well, by making sure that the end-user tariff is set at the right level. As long as it is, the end-user is going to be able to pay its bill, and the government does not have to respond to the guarantee. If the government, for political reasons, is not increasing the tariff, if the fuel cost goes up, as an example, becomes a shortfall in the system, and they're going to have to use the budget to supply that. So, most of these delays in financial closing processes is to get this balance right between what the government needs to do, what the DFI community is willing to do, and what the developers are willing to do. And we kind of dance around it every time and always land pretty much in the same place. So, if we can start where we know we're going to end up, we would have a much quicker process and get a lot more deals done. The other thing is, to the extent that we could have more standardized contracts. One thing about MIGA, a lot of people don't like the contracts, but the fact is they're standardized. Everybody uses the same contracts. Same in South Africa, the example I gave. Not everybody likes all the provisions of those contracts. There's provisions in there that the developers had to swallow quite hard to accept. But those are the only contracts you're going to get, so you get on with it. And things get done, things get built, and that's really remarkable success.
And just to pick up on the aspects of risk mitigation that we discussed and structuring and standing behind your risk, I mean, Chuck, maybe over to you. How do you interact with developers as a technology provider? What can you contribute in terms of risk mitigation?
It's interesting because all the discussions here are focused on risk and the ability to service debt and have a financially successful project. I think the fundamental message here is that a successful project will, in fact, assign the risk to parties that can mitigate and deal responsibly with the associated risk. If you structure a project whereby you have a bunch of attorneys in a room and they're trying to allocate risk by winning the game on who assumes the most risk, that's a recipe for failure. So from a technology provision perspective, first of all, we abide by the fact that the right technology selection for the right application. Fundamentally, anyone who's investing millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars into a project, eventually they're going to get to the right technology solution. And our assumption of risk, our assumption of responsibility is taken on from the perspective of, again, the right allocation of risk to the right party who can address those risks. And I think if all parties involved in a project assume the responsibilities that they should assume, including government entities, including the developers, including the financiers, and including the technology providers, you're going to have a much smoother process. You're going to have a project that's financeable and financeable in a relatively expeditious manner. And you'll have the ability to address shortcomings and shortfalls, which all projects do encounter, in a manner that is addressable from the responsible party's perspective.
That's quite interesting. Obviously, in the context of bearing and managing your own risks, I'm very much reminded of examples. For classic one is in Nigeria in terms of bunkering risk and how do you handle the question of reliability to fuel supply. And actually, one of the interesting lessons that came out of that was probably that a lot of that was down to managing community engagement and relations. And I thought, Sifo, for example, it was quite interesting what you said in your speech around the question of engaging with local community. Tell us a bit about that.
Well, what we noticed with Kariba, which is a big project, 50 years ago, 40 years ago, the local community was flooded out. Wouldn't happen today with all your IFC performance standards, but the local community was essentially flooded out. Power, huge 330 kV lines taking to capital cities, Harare and Lusaka and beyond, and the local communities completely lost out. So it really became something you didn't want in your backyard. And what we are finding is that engaging the community to get through a lot of the environmental hurdles, the land acquisition hurdles, and all of those issues, they actually bring something to the party. They may be rural communities, but there's a great level of sophistication now. And pulling them in, pulling in local country partners as well, who understand the lay of the land, which a foreign investor wouldn't, are very important to pulling this together. Zambia, to come on to the issue of tariffs, has a simple cost buildup. The Energy Regulation Board, you've got to demonstrate what your costs are, what your returns are, and that cost buildup comes into your tariff issue. A lot of these things are very negotiable. Governments are flexible, they're willing to, they understand where this looming power shortage is going to take them. They become very unpopular with load shedding, they can't create the jobs in time. So you have a very receptive audience. It's how you approach them. And I think one of the biggest issues is we are running short of time. I mean, we're way behind the curve in Africa. And this issue of how we finance it. Technically, the best way, Ravi, don't get too upset, is get rid of project finance. Project finance brings a great deal of rigor. And on the investor side, it's something that's excellent. But it also massively delays projects. The easiest way would be to try and find, and if I was sitting in the government position, the unbundling of assets would be a good way. The assets are working, you've got tariffs, you've got returns, sell those generation units and use that equity to finance new projects, equity finance them. They're quicker. You still have to apply some of the rigor that, because your future objective is to unbundle them. But really, Africa should be looking at how to equity finance a lot of these things because of the massive delays that are caused by project finance. One of our biggest issues on our small project on the Zambezi is the local community is saying, when are you starting? Well, get on with it. We've agreed, we're for it. The environmental teams come in, the social assessment teams come in, and they're saying, listen, don't ask us all these questions. We want power. So get on with it. But we have to go through those processes. We understand that. But this is the advantages of bringing your communities together.
See, if I can just react to that point, equity financing is good, but equity financing is not going to be enough for the huge needs of power, number one. Number two, if you do equity financing without debt, you're going to lower your returns. So it's not going to give you what you need. And I agree with you, project finance takes time, but if you follow my 3 principles, which I just highlighted in the 7 minutes that I had, you can cut down the time by 70%. If you just focus on those 3 elements, if you get that right, project financing doesn't take long.
Okay. That was quite, in a way, I think that also picked up a point that was discussed in the presidential debate around the question of, the cost of financing, particularly, international financing. But is it right to say that abandoning the rigors of doing these things properly is the right way forward? I suppose one of the issues that was discussed certainly in our speakers' lunch was the question of the presence of Chinese investors, for example, who might not take that long, who might be more direct in providing a solution. What are the benefits, do you find, of the project finance model in terms of pushing things forward? Michael, maybe your perspective on this would be of interest.
Well, I think there is a rigorous process of going through a project finance transaction. So the rigor actually in the end creates quite a sustainable project. So that is one of the advantages. The other advantage is as an investor, you can leverage your capital base, obviously, with project financing because it's non-recourse. It's only recourse to the project versus the balance sheet, which will be more limited in its capital use. So there are clear benefits. I think the project finance model has been very successfully employed across the world, and I think we should continue to use it in Africa. Over time, there might be other possibilities to finance power through the bond markets and so on, more on balance sheets. But, we're quite far away from there. So when you then compare, as the president of Uganda said, he likes his tariff at 3 cents versus Bujagali at 11, I guess he's thinking about getting Chinese Development Bank financing, 30-year concessionary type financing, 10 years grace, paying 0.5% interest or something. As long as that capital is available, of course it is difficult to compete with from the private sector, but the question is how much of that is available and what's the price, for the Chinese to engage on that basis. Normally they get something else in return, some other resource coming through, and when you add it all up, it might not in the end be the most cost-effective way. But the great thing about Africa, there's enough need, there's enough demand for all of us, whether that's Chinese, whether that's aid money, whether that's the private sector. So it all fits. It's all there for the taking, I think.
Well, thank you very much for that. I think with that, I'd like to throw open the questions to the floor. If I may ask speakers to raise their hand and then identify themselves. Please, the gentleman here and then the gentleman in front.
Hi, I'm Munish from IFC. On this question of tariffs, and there was a lot of views from panelists about the appropriate level of tariffs, especially for the final consumer. I guess my question is that much of the financing, even where it is closed successfully for projects, I guess much of it is in dollars, probably in floating rate terms, right? So question is, what happens over the life of the project, even when it's operational, as interest rates change, as currencies, FX rates change? Who bears the cost associated with those changes? are these risks hedged by the project companies, power companies, or are these risks being passed down to the weakest link in the chain, which is the end consumer? And this is also relevant for what happens when input prices change, fuel, et cetera. So just your views on that.
Sure. First of all, we don't do floating interest rates. It's always fixed. And even if a developer wanted to do floating interest rates, they would never be allowed to from the lenders group. So that's all fixed. Obviously, the capital comes mobilized in dollars, needs to get repaid in dollars. So the tariff will be denominated in dollars. So if the currency weakens, there's more of an obligation, and that becomes an issue for the ratepayers ultimately to address. But you think about it, the project cannot sustain those variable interest rate risks or variable fuel price risks. There's just no way that it can do that. So if the government were to build its own power plant and import the same amount of fuel, who would have to pay for that fuel bill? Well, there's only two places it can be paid for. It's either the end user or it's the taxpayer. So, when you think about the model, the private model, it's not that we got the ability to import fuel for lower costs. What we really do well is we build these projects on time, on budget. We operate them really well. We have very high availability. It's very high efficiencies. When we run distribution companies, we have much less losses, and we run them more efficiently. And that's what the private sector has contributed, across the world. When we started private power in the 70s and 80s in the U.S., you might remember the avoided cost structure where the private sector could actually build a facility for the avoided cost of the utility. And it lasted not for very long because those cost structures were way in excess of what the private sector needed. And then over time, it was no longer the avoided cost. You had a bid for those tariffs, and the tariffs came down very substantially through the private sector.
But if I can just add to that, this is a classic example of good planning of a project. If you, say, for example, have the best lawyered documents, and there are a lot of lawyers in this room, and I don't want to upset lawyers, but if you have the best lawyered document, and you have all your costs as a pass-through, okay, and you get it hedged, and you get dollar financing, and you pass it through the consumer, okay, and you have a currency which depreciates, okay, even if you have it hedged and even if you have it passed through, you're setting yourself up for failure in the future. Okay, and that's not the way to look at it from a financing perspective. Maybe developers look at it and they get their return, but from a lending perspective, that's not the way to look at it. The way to look at it is, yes, you've got to have all these hedged. Yes, you cannot have unhedged exposures on an interest rate. You've got to have it. But you cannot pass on all currency risk to the consumer. So you've got to have a judicious mix of local currency financing, and you've got to have a judicious mix of dollar financing. And you've got to have local currency mix to the extent the local capital markets and the local banks can absorb it, even if it's higher interest cost. Because at the end of the day, you want to save currency fluctuation. But the final answer actually comes in terms of your tariff with respect to the merit order in the dispatch of the system grid. So if you've used the best dollar financing, you've got the best hedge, and you've got a high tariff, you're going to have your contracts renegotiated. That's what happened in Asia. If you see the 1990s when these projects were financed, be it China, be it India, be it Indonesia, they were all renegotiated. So you've got to look at that and design it optimally, maximizing local currency debt and dollar debt, and looking at the tariff at the end in the system grid.
Thank you very much. We had a question up front. Sir, if you can identify yourself, and then I have one more question for the gentleman up front.
First, a bit of a contribution to the IFC question. I think.
Sorry, if you could identify yourself.
Yeah, my name is Leonard. I'm from Fidelity Bank, Ghana. The main mitigation is the tariff regime, whether it's liberalized or it's covered by government. In certain jurisdictions, government subsidizes, power, and that will be a challenge. So they mitigate that risk indirectly. But it's something which there's a question of whether it's sustainable or not. But where it is liberalized, then it's actually borne by consumers. So it passes over to consumers. But my main question actually goes to Ravi and maybe any of the speakers. It's about ECA financing. I'll first of all use some examples from Ghana. My financial institution financed 6 out of the last 8 IPPs in Ghana when there was deregulation of the sector. And what we've seen over this period was that most of these projects, most of the promoters are rather shying away from ECA financing. They prefer, either a hybrid, direct commercial loans, or a hybrid kind of project financing.
So your question, sorry.
Now, the main question is that what, maybe in the view of Ravi, can we do, to be able to have better access to ECA finance, make it more attractive for African entities, for us to be able to boost power production?
Thank you. Just before we answer that question, maybe the best way, so I ensure I take all the questions from the audience, if we could maybe pass the microphone around to the gentleman up front and then the gentleman, two gentlemen over there, address the questions, and then perhaps, as I understand we're running out of time, we can have some closing remarks from the speaker. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. My name is Eli Karuhanga from Uganda, Kampala Associated Advocates. Therefore, I'm a lawyer. I have been doing some of these deals for energy in Uganda, and I have come to some conclusions. So I have like 2 questions to ask, if you permit me.
Please.
My first conclusion is that the legal advisors who come with the financiers from abroad, when they arrive in our countries, they make it almost impossible to do a transaction. Almost impossible.
And what is the question?
They delay. No, I said I wanted to make some observations and then ask the questions.
Please, just because we have very limited time, if I can ask you to go directly to the questions. And this has nothing to do with the legal aspects.
I'm sorry about that. Okay, I drop the international legal advisors because otherwise I will lose my microphone.
Absolutely.
The point is made. 2, there are too many authorities and regulations to negotiate a deal in energy, because you have got the regulatory authority, you have the transmission company which will buy the power, which will need to negotiate the PPA, the regulatory authority which has to approve it, then you have the ministry which has to do the implementation agreement, and all these things take 2 years to do a deal. And this is unacceptable. It's unacceptable to especially the person who is sponsoring the project. Then you have got the complete misunderstanding of the politicians who don't have any idea about how it goes on to actually conclude a deal. And they want to say something about it. Then they have the worst thing, which is the tariff, which the President Museveni talked about yesterday, which you have touched on.
And sir, sorry,
what's the question?
Just your question,
the question now
if I can ask you. Yeah.
What are you going to do to match the Chinese who come and give 3% to African governments? Are you going to be completely cut off? Is there a way that you are thinking about to sort this matter out?
Understood. Thank you very much.
The second question.
Oh, I'm sorry, please.
What are we going to do with the international lawyers who are making it almost impossible? Because the way they try to insist on very insignificant things create and kill deals.
I think I might take that question. Thank you very much. Passing that on. Thank you.
My name is Samuel, and I'm the chairman of Creative Africa. We have ease of access to 4 head of states in Africa and over 15 ministers. We have key players in the energy sector talk to us, we talk to our friends. I cry all the time when I go to Africa, coming out from Europe or even landing in America. You see light everywhere, but when you come to Africa, Africa is in total darkness. You have over 90 million children goes to school without no access to power. Africa needs about $300 billion to be able to help solve the energy problem. It takes over 5 to 7 years to get a project from the design stage to the finishing stage. My question to you, sir, is to you, sir, the U.S. Power for Africa. What are you doing in pushing the government to be able to look at ways to reduce this time it takes to get project done?
Thank you very much.
Okay, so I'll try to address a couple of the questions really quickly.
Do you mind if we just take one last question, then I promise I will give you the...
I've got a plane to catch, so I may have to step off the stage in 3 minutes. So.
Okay, if we just take one more question, and then Andrew, the floor is yours.
My name is Ibrahima Diong, and I'm from Senegal. The question goes to the gentleman from Standard Chartered. I heard you mention many times the importance of unbundling the sector. As a friend of mine used to say, if you get 3 things that are all equal to 0, if you divide it by 3, it will still be equal to 0. So the question that I have for all of you, and this is really the question as an African that we struggle with, how do we address the production problem that we have on the continent? All over Africa, you get a deficit in production, an average 100 megawatts. The question is, what do we need to do from your perspective to address that problem? The second question, which is related to that, is the source of energy. If you look at the coal power, the development institution have a problem with coal. If you look at hydropower, it takes the time to develop hydropower. Solar is limited. So what do we get left? Heavy fuel. It's very expensive. So the question to all of you, how do you address the sourcing issues and the production issues before we talk about transporting it to where it's needed?
Thank you very much. If I can just hand over, as promised, the floor to Andrew too.
Thank you. Just so really quickly on the issue. So I'm a lawyer, and so one of the first things that I discovered when I started working on Power Africa, someone asked me for $800,000 to hire a lawyer to help negotiate a deal. And I said, well, who's the lawyer? What's his billing rate? And they said $800 an hour. He's out of New York. And I said, well, that's too much money. And the response is, well, his normal rate's $1,000 an hour. Made me quickly realize that we got to figure out how to get the cost of lawyers down. But also, as annoyed as you may be by international lawyers, it's essential that the governments are represented by high-quality international lawyers, because there needs to be a level playing field. As irritating as I find other lawyers, being a lawyer myself, there's a good reason why they're often insisting on the terms that they're insisting on, but I don't expect to have to understand every nuance of it, and this is why we pay them to do it. They're a key part of making these deals successful and sustainable in the long run. I've heard governments talk about corrupt deals that they negotiated in the past, and they politicize them. These weren't corrupt deals. These were poorly negotiated deals, which is why Power Africa has helped put money into the African Development Bank's African Legal Support Facility to hire top-quality legal counsel to represent the governments themselves when they're negotiating. So Corbeti Geothermal in Ethiopia, the government of Ethiopia has never negotiated a PPA before. They're being represented by one of the top lawyers from Clifford Chance, sitting across the table from the top lawyers, from the development company, and that's why the deal is going to work. But we made sure that they hired lawyers who are focused on making the deal happen, not making sure that it falls apart, and it's getting the right lawyers on the deals. The other thing that we're doing, and this goes to reducing the time, is we realize that the legal process, the negotiation, is what often takes the longest period of time. It can drag on for years. Negotiating the PPA itself is a problem. So we've been bringing some of the best lawyers from all over the world, plus host government lawyers together to develop annotated power purchasing agreements that'll explain, if you're the developer, this is what you want the clause to say. If you're the government, this is what you want to negotiate. So everything is developed almost like a treatise to help expedite the process of that PPA negotiation. And that can reduce the time by months, if not years.
Well, here, that's all I can say. And before you plug the competition, then maybe I can hand out some cards at the end. But maybe if I can just ask our speakers if anyone wants to make some closing remarks. I think fascinating though this has been, I'm now being told that we should bring the session to a close.
Could I?
What do you want to do with those 5 questions? You just want to leave them then, or?
Well, what I was going to do was just ask you, please, if you wouldn't mind, just in 30 seconds, give us a quick summary for each speaker, and then we can bring them to a close. I appreciate that, we're under some time pressure. So maybe, Michael, if you wouldn't mind, just briefly give.
Well, I used my 30 seconds to answer some of the questions that were then asked, right? So what can we do on speed to get more things done quicker? I think an excellent example is what happened in South Africa, where there were standard contracts put out. They were reviewed by the international lawyers, agreed on, and they were bankable financial agreements. So there was no real time wasted in negotiating those contracts once the process started. The question about more export credit agency financing, I think that, export credit agency financing is widely available in Africa. It's just a question of where you procure your equipment. And you also find that many of the big equipment suppliers have their own in-house financial teams that would actually help you organizing those export credit agency financings. So we don't see a shortage of export credit agency financing. We see quite a lot of it. Chinese financing, we're not going to compete with the Chinese financing. As I said, the market is big enough for all of us. If the Chinese wants to bring low-cost money, and as they are doing in some markets, I think that's contributed to economic development alongside the private sector. International lawyers, I'm not going to comment on. The source of power, it's not so that oil is the only available resource. I think gas is domestic gas in Africa is clearly a very good source of fuel, cost-effective and clean to the extent it's available. There's also renewable sources coming into play. And from each country, you have to kind of look at that mix so you have the right balance of different sources of fuel. It's a hugely important question for the government to get right, I think. But generally speaking, they tend to get that equation right.
Thank you. Chuck, any closing remarks?
Yes, quite simply, risk mitigation, proper allocation of risk to the responsible parties, I think, is fundamental for a project success. With respect to technology selection, the right technology for the right application, and I may say that General Electric is not the only technology provider in this world. And with respect to the Chinese, I think you really have to take a stand back and look at what else comes along with a pot of gold, if you will. It's not always a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow as it relates to the Chinese. So I would be cautious and look at it from a long-term perspective.
Thank you, Chuck. Ravi?
Yeah, everybody here has asked questions about timing, okay, and I tried to give it in my opening 7 minutes. If you look at the three fundamentals which I told you about, you can shorten this time. But there are no quick fixes. You need international lawyers, you need local lawyers, you need local banks, and you need the risk mitigated correctly with the right party taking the risk, and you need the right tariff. And the more the governments spend time, and the more the private developers and the banks spend time, the more you're going to have a sustainable power development for Africa. And I can say this with confidence that Africa started off and is doing it right. Now, to the question which the gentleman from Senegal raised, and he raised a very good point. And he says that these things are taking time, okay, but there's a burning need for power. Absolutely. But you can't sacrifice this because you have a burning need for power. So the way to look at it is to tackle both. And the real solutions to Africa power don't lie on the grid. They actually lie off the grid. So the off-grid solutions are the short-term solutions which you need to bridge. And those will probably be a bit more expensive till the longer-term power comes in, but they'll solve the solution. So the off-grid solutions, which will give you the quick fix, working side by side with these long-dated plants which take time, but fixing the regulation, fixing the tariff in a manner that is sustainable is the way for Africa to go and the way for Africa to meet its short-term requirements.
Thank you very much, Ravi. And Sifo, a closing remark, and then I'll bring the session to a close.
I think the issue is not, what is Power Africa doing, what are the international investors are doing. The issue is, what is Africa doing? What are we doing? It's up to us to plan. This deficit is not a surprise. We've seen it coming. We're the ones who live in that growth. We see where the growth is coming, way before the big Western investors have seen this. And it's up to us to make those decisions. The international lawyers, as far as I'm concerned, I hire them, they're on our side. I want them next to me fighting, but I've also got local lawyers. All of these things it's our planning. If there's a failure in anything, it's our failure to plan. It's not Power Africa. Power Africa coming to assist. Do we want them to assist? Yes, fine, we'll take that assistance. The Chinese 3%, great. It's not only 3% that the Chinese are asking for. That might be the headline figure, but there are other issues behind those deals. But we've talked to the Chinese just as quickly as we've talked to Western investors, and we will take the best deal. And as Africans, that's our obligation. to find the best deal, whether it's from the east, the west, doesn't matter. And quickest route to market, and as Ravi says, with the rigor of getting it right. That's my view.
See, bottom line is you need a good financial advisor. Come to Standard Chartered Bank.
Very good. Well, thank you all very much. I think you'll all agree it's been a very stimulating discussion, and of course we
Good financial
plumb the entire depths from the joys of setting a tariff to the pleasures of dealing with international lawyers. So with that final thought, I'd like to thank you very much and to hand over back to our MC.
And thank you very much, Dimitri, and the panel. Thank you very much indeed. And that concludes our final session.